Hello, Andra. Thanks a lot for the intro. And hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. So we'll have Eric with us in just a few minutes. I'm going to just set the context first. So thanks a lot for the intro, Audra. So I'd like to add to that and say that I often, even though I've written a book, I go around and teach a lot of this methodology at this point, I often still identify myself first and foremost as a practicing entrepreneur. And going back in time, I've been an entrepreneur for many, many years, and what got me into all of this was this quote right here by Edward Deming. I had built many different products along the way, had varying levels of success. Some were just outright failures. Some of them had mediocre success. Some had much better success. But throughout that process, I didn't really know what I was doing. I couldn't really derive cause and effect to why certain things worked and certain things didn't. And that started my own parallel journey for finding a repeatable process, or what I would call a meta process, for not necessarily guaranteeing that I would build a successful product, but that would raise my odds of building that. And so even prior to the lean startup, I had been trying all kinds of different things. I had built products in stealth. I had employed techniques like release early, release often, the popular 37 signals mantra of less is more. I even tried more is more, which is just throw out a lot of features. So I've been experimenting a lot along the way. And then I ran into the early works of Eric Ries and Steve Blank, who started the movement first with customer development, which eventually turned into what we now know as the lean startup. And I immediately was attracted to that. A lot of the concepts there were things that resonated very strongly with me. I could see why certain things I had done were not working. But as I began to apply those principles, I had more questions than answers. So Eric was talking about his retrospective learning from IMVU, which was at that point a lean startup machine. They were pushing out 50 releases a day, and I was too small of a company to be able to do those kinds of things. And so I started looking for a more practicable framework for doing it, and that's what got me started into blogging and sharing my learning, and eventually got turned into a book. So that's how I got into all of this. Now, along the way, the big epiphany that hit me was realizing that the product that I thought I was building, which was my solution, and that's how a lot of us entrepreneurs approach our businesses, is we believe if we just build this great product, all good things will happen. I realized that the product I was building wasn't just the solution. The solution was, by all means, important and had to be good, it had to be right for the market. But what was really the product was the entire business model. And coming from a technical background myself, I knew how to build products, and that's what I'd done my entire career. And so I began to apply a lot of the same playbook techniques from product development to, say, business model development. So my original thinking of business models were more go out and write a business plan, get investors, and the business plan is something you do in retrospect after you have a product working. And I switched that around where now I deliberately go out and try to build a business model versus build a product. And that's, in a nutshell, how I codified these three meta principles that you'll see in the book Running Lean. And it's heavily derived on a lot of the lean startup principles of scientific testing, which we're going to talk a lot about today. So if I quickly walk through that, the first part of the process is documenting your plan A. This is nothing more than applying divide and conquer, so taking a complex problem, in this case building a business, and decomposing it into its component pieces. So what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is this lean canvas format, which is a one-page business model format, decomposing it into these pieces and being able to put it together to where at least it works as a model on paper. The next step is then to figure out what is riskiest, not necessarily what is easiest. So this is a very important point because most products that we launch today fail not because we failed to build the product, not because we failed to build the solution, but because we fail to capture the right customers and markets for that solution. And so you want to start with what is riskiest on the model, not necessarily what's easiest, and then finally apply an experimental mindset to start testing those risky components in the business model. And that, in a nutshell, is what these meta principles are really about that I describe in the book. Now, since the book has come out, I found that a lot of these ideas in the book, as well as the lean startup body of work in general, sound like common sense. We have a lot of people nodding their heads, and they get this. It's easy to understand, but what I found is very hard to put to practice. And so what I want to do today is really get into some of those topics, really more around hypothesis generation, experiment design, and with Eric's help, try to help demystify some of that, some of those difficulties. So if I was to show you a picture.
Hi, Ash.
Yes, go ahead.
It looks like Eric has joined us. Hello, Eric.
Hey, everybody.
Hi there, Eric.
Hey, Ash. How's it going?
Doing well. Good to have you. So,
good to have you.
Just setting the context, and then we'll start the fireside chat here in a minute or so.
Whenever you're ready. I'm on standing by.
Perfect. So I was just describing the process of running experiments, how it typically starts out. So this picture that you're seeing here, hopefully you're seeing the slide with the ceiling of achievement, is how, as entrepreneurs, we go out and start running experiments. So oftentimes we have this great idea. We say, okay, I'm going to apply these lean techniques. I'm going to run this experiment. Most of our first experiments don't go as planned, and so we quickly hit this ceiling of achievement. So it's not what we expect to happen, and it's disappointing. We have this period of resignation. But then in the lean startup body of work, we have this magic word called the pivot. Unfortunately, it's a highly abused term because a lot of people interpret that as an excuse to change your mind and try again. So we use that, and we go ahead and run the next set of experiments. I would kind of qualify the word pivot, and Eric kind of has the same definition, as a pivot is really something that has to be grounded in learning. It's a change in strategy, and it should not happen as easily as we see it happening out there today. So it needs to be grounded in learning. It needs to be built on some root cause analysis. If you don't get the expected result that you desired, you have to try to get to why that didn't happen and use that learning to then pivot to something different. Otherwise, you're just employing a disguised see what sticks strategy, which, as we know, is not the most optimal way to reach that breakthrough insight. So the result, what we end up seeing, and I see this with a lot of entrepreneurs that are, with their best intentions, trying to apply lean startup techniques, is we're going through this cycle of disappointment, resignation, and pivots, and we're never really achieving that feeling of achievement. So again, what I want to share with you today are some of these best practices or some of these techniques for how you might break through that cycle, break through that trap. So we have with us today Eric Ries, the author of best-selling book Lean Startup. And what we're going to do for the first part, so I'll come out and say that I'm terrible at multitasking. I know some people run these webinars and they're tweeting and they're taking questions and they're presenting all at the same time. I'm terrible at multitasking, so we're going to do this in serial fashion. So we're going to spend 30 minutes. Eric and I are going to have a conversation. And then in the meanwhile, if you have questions, feel free to pipe them into the Q&A section. We'll have Audra moderate for the next 30 minutes, and these questions can be directed both at me or Eric, and we'll address those for 30 minutes. And then I will end with a few slides and some wrap-up on how we can put some of this stuff to practice. Does that sound like a plan, Eric?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, so let's get started. Let me get to the first slide here. Okay, so I did want to start by going to science. So the lean startup is often described as a scientific approach to building successful companies, and that by itself suggests that there is a process, or at least a meta process, for engineering startup success. Now, others are quick to dismiss that comparison. They say, well, surely entrepreneurship is a lot harder than just running a few experiments. And I think that stems from a misunderstanding of how science is conducted, and somehow that process is supposed to be an easy comparison or an easy process. Can you comment on that a bit, Eric?
Oh, yeah, I love that. I love that question. Someone that you and I know well, who I shall remain nameless for the purposes of this conversation, I said recently, entrepreneurship can't be turned into a science, because if it was a science, anybody could do it.
Yep.
And I remember hearing that and thinking, boy, that is hilarious, because science is a science and very few people can do it.
Right.
You think about the people that we know who are really good scientists. It's a very small fraction of the population. It's an extremely difficult and grueling career. And what makes it hard, I don't think people really understand that, when you have a legitimate scientific breakthrough, like in school, when you learn, I learned in must have been the 7th grade or something about the scientific method. I was taught it like some kind of rote checklist exercise. Like first you formulate your problem statement, hypothesis, problem. This is a very linear process. And the only experiments we ever did in class were ones where we already knew the answer in advance. So if you didn't get the right answer, it meant you didn't do the experiment right. You start over. Yep. I don't know how anyone thinks that's like science education. It doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, real science, you have to be committed, passionately committed to some line of investigation, to like a grand hypothesis that you're trying to prove or disprove. And then you have to go through the grueling work of devising and constantly running experiments designed to help you figure out what's actually true in the world and what's not. So as a model for entrepreneurship, like I can't imagine a role model I would rather have than the great scientists.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I was just going to add to that is that, yes, the ninth grade or seventh grade class is what's kind of tainted us. We think it's just repetition of experiments to verify results that we already know, when it's the exact opposite. The breakthroughs have to start with the kind of those new concepts, those new ideas. The other thing I also found is that running experiments isn't even the most important thing that scientists do. So the reason I put Einstein up here is he managed to develop the theories of relativity. He managed to predict the speed of light, which was later empirically validated by what we call empirical scientists, to great accuracy. And he did all of this without running a single experiment, at least in the classical sense. So one of the things that I often kind of use is that experimentation is a very important part of the lean startup and of what scientists do, but it's really verification of a model that is really the most important thing scientists do. So the way that Einstein was able to do some of his great achieve those great breakthroughs was by building simpler models, which weren't too simple. They were approximations of the problem domain that he was trying to tackle, in this case, model the universe. But he was able to do them with these simple thought experiments and then reach some breakthrough thinking, which he then verified in his case with math and science, and later empirical scientists came in and validated that they were actually true. And to this day, we run experiments trying to prove that.
I think what people forget is that it's not like Einstein was just sitting in the patent office fantasizing. He was both extremely acquainted with the existing experimental literature, so he had access to the existing empirical data, and he had the language of mathematics to try and tie together. And he was hunting for anomalies in the data. So like the reason he was building those new models is because the old models were starting to break down. One of the harbingers of paradigm change. So anyway, I don't want to get too abstruse of a topic, but I think the parallels there are actually very strong. If you look at the greatest entrepreneurs who were domain experts, in some specific business, realized that there's something deeply wrong with how that business is conducted, and said, I think I know a solution. As you say, the experiment, when they finally actually get around to making the product, is just the verification of the thing that they came in believing. Right.
And so I think that as entrepreneurs, we need some similar models. And so two of the models that I kind of use quite heavily, one of them is the Lean Canvas format, which is the one-page business model format that I show here a little bit early on. And the other one, and that's more of this top-down model. I feel like entrepreneurs need to have at least a ballpark top-down model. I'm not a big fan of extensive top-down modeling, but at least a ballpark model. But more importantly, having a bottoms-up model. And there I tend to use more of the customer lifecycle, or what we know as Dave McClure's Pirate metrics. Are there other types of models that you use in your work with companies, Eric? I know you talk a lot about the engine of growth.
I'm sorry, the audio cut out for me, so I didn't hear the question.
Oh, I was asking if there are other kinds of models. I know you are doing a lot of work with the engine of growth kind of a modeling for companies to model growth. Are there other models that you would use in your work with entrepreneurs?
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Sorry, I don't know what. I hope the problem's not on my end. So I think there's been it's been very fashionable to talk about growth and growth hacking, and Paul Graham has a great essay recently called Startup Equals Growth. People are starting to, I think, to understand that creating a product that is valuable is only half the story in entrepreneurship. We need to make sure that the change that we see in the world is scalable to be able to have the kind of impact that we want, and growth is the kind of the answer to that. But growth is the output of a product and a business model that's working. And the problem with glorifying growth by itself is it confuses two different kinds of growth, what I call sustainable and unsustainable growth. And sustainable growth is, I think, what we really should have as our explicit goal when building a startup. And sustainable growth is characterized by one very simple rule, which is that new customers come from the actions of past customers. And, I believe in this framework I call engines of growth, just as a simple way to remind myself of the 3 different ways that I'm aware of that new customers can come from the actions of past customers. And I'll just mention the 3 engines of growth briefly, and then, Ash, we can dive in if you and the audience are interested, but I don't want to belabor the point if not. In the paid engine of growth, the first of the 3, we take the revenue we make from customers and reinvest in customer acquisition. So you see that feedback loop as the faster we gather money from customers, the faster our payback period, the more that is available to invest in new acquisition. So that engine, I always use the metaphor of an engine because it's like an internal combustion engine where each firing of the cylinder powers the next one. The speed at which that engine will turn is determined by only one metric. The metric is the marginal cost of customer acquisition. If we make $1, if it costs us $1 to acquire a customer, we make $2 from them, then that's 50% margin. That business is going to grow a lot faster than a business that only makes $1.10 for each dollar invested. And the same framework applies in B2C, where we might be talking about pennies per customer, or all the way up to enterprise sales, where is the same logic. If we cost $100,000 to get a customer, but our lifetime value is $110,000, that's literally exactly the same growth framework as $1 versus $1.10. The viral engine of growth is the second one. Viral engine of growth happens when new customers are acquired as a natural consequence of the normal usage of the product by our existing customers. So if you think about PayPal, nobody sits down at their computer and says, today I want to be a great evangelist for PayPal. It's going to be so fun. This is not word of mouth. Word of mouth is optional. Virus is not optional. So, there's a terrible epidemic ravaging your town. You don't get to be like, I'm going to opt out of the epidemic. I'm not interested. That's not what an epidemic means. It's involuntary transmission from person to person. So when somebody gets the email that says, hey, Ash has sent you money via PayPal, click here, guess what? Every human being in the planet clicks on that email. That's one of the highest click-through rates of all emails of all time because it's free money. Of course you're going to take it. And so no one's trying to spread PayPal. Just as a natural consequence of the product in use. And I won't get into the math of viral coefficient unless people are interested, but there's a mathematical model that we've borrowed from epidemiology that shows how fast the viral engine of growth turns. And the last is what I call the sticky engine of growth. This is for businesses with very high retention. And in a very high retention situation, your growth will look like a compounding interest table because you naturally, through word of mouth, acquire more customers than you churn out because your products are so sticky. So any products that are addictive, literally addictive like pharmaceuticals, but also metaphorically addictive like, enterprise software, we have strong lock-in, or products with really strong network effects, video games that actually are extremely fun, retention-based games like World of Warcraft, all have that same engine of growth. So those are the models that I tend to use to model sustainable growth.
Right. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and so I think if we have more questions in the Q&A, we'll dive into details. But the key message I want to put out there is that, again, using that science analogy, is that we can actually model customer behavior. We can actually model growth. We can model some of the earlier stages of the product. And at the end of the day, that's still a model, but we can use those models to measure progress then against it. But we'll kind of shift back and even go one level one level back and talk about hypothesis generation, because I find that to be, again, since we're in that theme of science, a very hard topic for people to kind of put their heads around, and I'll talk about why. So I have this quote by Eric. So Eric famously said that entrepreneurs we can't simply wait to see what happens because we'll always succeed because something is guaranteed to happen. And if we couple that with the fact that as entrepreneurs we are especially gifted at retrospective rationalization, it guarantees that we can never, ever be wrong. We can always convince ourselves that we are on the right path, no matter what happens. So the solution to this is to take another one of these tactics out of the scientific method, something we'd call falsifiable hypothesis generation, which is just a fancy way of saying we need to declare expected outcomes up front, but not just that, but state it in such a way that it's clear and specific, so it's specific and testable. And I have an example here of a vague statement and one that's a lot more specific and testable. So writing a blog post that will generate over 100 signups is something you can actually do. There's a clear action and an expected outcome. Now, I found that this, again, is one of those things that's very simple to describe and people nod their heads, but it's more easily said than done. And I find that there are two main causes for this. The first is that people are really afraid of declaring these kinds of outcomes up front because they hate to be proven wrong. The second is sometimes we just don't have enough information. When we're starting out, if you were launching a new web app or a new iPhone app, you just don't know how many click-throughs you're going to get on your site or to the app or whatever the metric is you're measuring. And so we just feel like we don't have enough data to even make these declarations. So what is your advice, Eric, for how entrepreneurs should tackle that? I would say that as the product matures, we gain a lot more insights into what works and what doesn't. But in the earlier days, how does one kind of navigate that?
Yeah. So if you look at the online literature for split testing and experimental design, a lot of it comes out of established companies. So you look at the Amazon Hippo paper and Microsoft Hippo paper, and you have these these companies that are talking about, hey, okay, we have a situation where our normal click-through rates are blah, and a statistically significant change after we roll the experiment out to 100,000 people is, a 3% lift in conversion. We know that's significant because of the size of the sample. Therefore, that's what you should do. And startup entrepreneurs, I think, get really confused by that because, if you have that kind of baseline to work against, we would say if you want to make forecasts, you need a long and stable operating history from which to make the forecast. And if you can make a forecast that is accurate, then you're not in a startup situation because startups are defined by the uncertainty about the things that we don't know. So the key to getting out of that trap is to say if the signal-to-noise ratio of what we're trying to measure is very, very high, then we don't need a very large sample or extremely high accuracy forecast to learn something from it. So let me give you an example of just get, people sometimes think about lean startup as mostly about software. I'll give you a really different example. I was just recently working with a company that makes a very, very, very high-end medical diagnostics product. It's based on a revolutionary new science. It's super cool. Many years in development in the lab just to get the science to work, and it's going to be very cool if it can be commercialized. But yeah, a very high uncertainty situation because no device like this has ever been built before. It's so completely new. And so the team, when I've been working with them, really trying to get them to instead of just spending years and years and years and years making a plan, doing the big commercial launch, say, no, let's build the minimum viable product. Let's actually get an experiment in market, and let's try to see what happens. But the good thing about a team like this is that because they have a science background, all this experimental design and hypothesis testing comes easier to them than people who have more of a traditional business background. So, but then they kind of wanted to make it complicated because it's we don't really know. Who knows? If we take this offer, we build this product, we actually, the MVP we designed is a shell of the product, shows what the workflow will look like. It has kind of a demo screens and demo diagnostic information in it. So it's you can set it up in a lab and the customer can actually experience what it would be like to have this technology in their own lab. But it's a concierge MVP. It's all happening Wizard of Oz style behind the scenes. The technology is not actually ready to be used in that way. And we'll have the customer come in and pre-order, be given the chance to pre-order the technology for when it's actually ready. Now, we can't really even begin to predict the conversion rate on the pre-order. We don't really know. We have no idea what the pricing of this thing should be. There's still some major business model questions. Licensing terms, the contract for this is going to run to 100 pages if I had to guess. It's a very complicated B2B type sale. But that's okay because we don't have to predict all that stuff with great accuracy. We have to say, what does the team actually passionately believe is true about this technology? And then write that down. So I actually really did this exercise with us. I said, everybody take out a note card and just write down some things that you believe are true about what's going to happen when we bring our first customer into our lab. And one of the things that one of the people wrote down was, this is a complicated, it's hard for customers to understand what the technology does. It's very hard for us to explain. But once they experience it, then they love it. They just cannot live without it. And I was like, that is a great hypothesis. It's soft. It's not quantitative yet, but it's a very specific claim about what will happen. It says, if a customer can see this for real and understand what it is, then they will absolutely have to have it. So we then can make that really quantitative. The easiest hypotheses are the ones where you believe 100% of people are going to do something. Because, great, it's very easy to invalidate such a hypothesis. So it's like, great, the first customer we bring in, if they're in our target demographic and if they go through the demo and if they understand it, if they're not begging us to install this in their lab, then we can start to raise a question about, hey, are we actually on the right track?
Sure. Okay. Let's shift gears and talk now about how we hold innovation accountable. So I know there's a concept you talk a lot about, innovation accounting, which is a shift from the traditional, more revenue-based accounting model, which works for more established products, to one that helps us account for progress in earlier stage products. So all that sounds good. I guess one of the things I want to talk about is how do we communicate innovation accounting effectively with external stakeholders. Now, these stakeholders could be inside a company. They're the ones who hold the resources that we need for the project, so they could be an external investor, for instance. Now, if you follow the innovation accounting model in those earlier stages, we are proving things in smaller scale. The right way to measure progress is in batches of customers using per-customer metrics versus what we call the vanity metrics, the aggregate metrics, which look nice and graphs that go up and to the right. But when we do this, we often get these depressing flatline curves. So I have this picture here, something I like to call the Groundhog Day effect. So from the movie Groundhog Day, where the protagonist is just stuck in this infinite loop and has to come up with some breakthrough insight to get out of that loop. So as entrepreneurs, we find ourselves many times in this situation, and it's really scary and depressing to go into a boardroom and present a flatline graph. And that's even a case where we're adding users every month over month. If we weren't, this would even be worse. We'd have gaps in these lines. And so I often liken this to the red pill, blue pill-like decision from the Matrix that entrepreneurs sometimes have to make. If they're pursuing things like funding or they're trying to get external stakeholders to look at progress, they're kind of making this hard decision. Or I would say this, I won't call it a hard decision, but in their mind it is. But it's making this decision between, do I play the success theater side of things or do I actually present the truth? What are your thoughts or feedback on how to navigate that?
Yeah, this is a big topic, and I think it's both one of the most important topics in entrepreneurship right now and one of the most boring. So I apologize to all of our listeners. Accounting is boring. I mean, nobody is interested in accounting. I don't even think accounting people are interested in accounting. It's so boring. But if we don't fix the accounting we do in startups, they can't succeed. I mean, I can't tell you how many promising innovations I have seen crushed due to this problem. So I really want us to take it seriously, but it is a difficult thing to talk about because it's accounting and whatever. So I apologize in advance, but we have to tackle it. So the first thing is there is no entrepreneurship without accountability. There's no such thing. Every entrepreneur, and I have seen this in the boardroom, in a corporate entrepreneurship situation where you're accountable to your CFO, right? Somebody in the corporation gave you money and resources. They want to, hey, how did you spend them? In a venture-backed startup situation where you have a VC that's invested in your company and wants to know, hey, what did I get for my LP's money? But even the garage solopreneurs, there's always somebody. There's a spouse. There's a family. Like the money came from somewhere. And there's somebody who wants to know, hey, are we making progress? Plus, no matter how great an entrepreneur you are, I predict that at some point you will have to hire at least one other person. Well, as soon as you have somebody working for you, then they're going to want to know, are we making progress, right? Their morale and their commitment to the cause is dependent on, do they think we're actually making progress? And so being able to answer that question is absolutely fundamentally critical. And what happens is, as entrepreneurs, we make these elaborate promises in order to gain the resources. So in order to get someone to join the company, you say, we're going to have this incredible world-changing success. To get the corporate money, you say, we're going to make you $100 million and we're going to be a new division of the company. To raise VC, you say, hey, let me show you this hockey stick-shaped graph of the future earnings that we're going to have, over the next 5 years. So as entrepreneurs, we actually create this bad accountability system. It's actually our fault. We're the ones that proposed it in the first place in order to get what we thought we needed. And then, the VC, their favorite trick in the book is just to turn it right around and say, hey, you gave me this graph. And now, here we are a year in, and it says we should have X results. Do we have X results? If not, well, then you didn't do what you said you're going to do, and now, I should get more equity in your company. We should have major dilution because you're not succeeding. So we have to find a way out of that trap. The problem, Ash, you summarized it really well, is that the temptation is always going to want to be to show a graph of big numbers up and to the right, because that's what we promised in the beginning to get the revenue. And the problem is that learning is not denominated in vanity metrics. So no one really cares about learning, let's be honest. You never meet a CFO that's like, well, this team squandered a bunch of my money, but they got great learning, so I'm going to put that in the annual report. That's awesome. Like, no. You have to be able to show quantitatively that the learning you're getting is worth something to the person who you're showing it to. So here's how I coach teams to get out of this dilemma, and it's kind of an involved answer, so I apologize. It's just how it is.
It is a big one, yeah.
This is a big topic. Listen, stop me if the hosts tell us that the Webcast audience is starting to die from boredom, I will stop. But short of that, I think we have to get through this. It's really important.
Well, I'm
actually pro business plan. I may be the only person left in the lean startup movement who's pro business plan. And here's the part of the business plan that I like, not the pros and the lofty claims and the total BS competition section. I like the spreadsheet. Every business plan has a spreadsheet in it. And in corporate America, they call it the business case. But it's somebody has done the work to say, okay, logically speaking, if this thing works, here's how much money we're going to make. If this is a big opportunity, it's worth investing in. And I think that's a very important exercise. Now, where we run into trouble with business plans, and the reason I have such a bad reputation these days in entrepreneurial circles, well-deserved in my opinion, is that we focus on the outputs of the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet says in year 3 we will make $25 million. So if we only make $18 million in year 3, that's a failure. That's the wrong way to use that spreadsheet. That's actually a complete waste of time. Instead, we want to look at the inputs to the spreadsheet. The inputs are where the power is. The inputs say if 10% of customers would buy this product, and if they would be willing to pay on average $25 lifetime value, and if our cost of customer acquisition was about $2.50, then as we roll the engine of growth forward, as we project forward, look how much money we would make. And the reason that argument, the spreadsheet is an argument for what should happen if our theory is correct. The reason it's so powerful is that spreadsheet can help us turn learnings into dollars. So I talk about focusing on learning milestones rather than business or product milestones. And a learning milestone begins by saying for each of those inputs, let's as soon as possible establish the baseline. So let's go find out where we are right now. That's why we do minimum viable product, all this initial rapid experimentation testing. The reason we get in market as soon as possible is just to establish what are those conversion rates today. What is the lifetime value of a customer? Now take the example I just gave, where we're supposed to have $25 lifetime value. I've been in a lot of MVPs where basically the lifetime value in the first experiment is pretty close to zero. Maybe not exactly zero, it's like $1. And you're like, crap. We don't want to go to a board meeting and say, hey, everybody, huge failure. Lifetime value, order of magnitude too low, we're doomed. But what I'm trying to teach investors and corporate accountants and just everybody who holds entrepreneurs accountable is that figuring out where you are is progress, even if it shows bad news, because it's better to have bad news that's true rather than good news that we just made up. And then this is where the power of innovation accounting comes in. As we make progress from that baseline, so imagine the first MVP has $1 lifetime value, but the next MVP is $2. Well, now we can rerun the spreadsheet with those inputs changed and show that we just made the business more valuable. Because nobody cares about if I have 10 customers and I make $2 each, if I made $20, nobody cares. But if I can say, listen, a $2 lifetime value means this is actually a marginally profitable business 5 years from now. Then $3, I say, hey, it's actually starting to get pretty good. Hey, now we're up to $10. We still are. It's still not a $100 million business. It's more like $15 million. But we're making progress, and the progress is denominated in units that the person holding us accountable cares about. That's really the nirvana that we need to achieve.
Right. Yeah, great. I think that I think kind of communicates the heart of the kind of building that model and then incrementally testing yourself against achieving that and showing forward progress. And so that's again where the flatlining is, where you're spinning wheels, and if you're making positive improvement towards the model working, then you're maybe on that right track.
You know,
but I do agree. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I do still feel like the big challenge here is getting the dialogue going on both sides. We have the stakeholders, which tend to be just typically, I wouldn't say always, but typically tend to be more growth-driven, but kind of creating that awareness of being okay with small scale and the model not quite doing what needs to happen, and being patient with that.
Yeah. People always talk about value-added investors, smart money versus dumb money and all this stuff. And people have a really hard time quantifying, like, what does it mean? Like, what is the difference between a value-added investor and a non-value-added investor, smart money and dumb money? And a lot of things that the smart money can do for you, connections and press and, name brand and that kind of stuff. But I think that stuff is very minor compared to what is their framework that they use for holding you accountable. The best investors I know get this innovation accounting thing intuitively. And so if you're willing to do the work of laying out the argument for them and showing them the logic of what you're doing and show how what you're doing will lead to growth if your theory is right, they're very patient. And it's the what I would call the dumb money, who is like, what's your week-over-week growth rate and how come it slowed, and, hey, go get on TechCrunch, go do some publicity stunts, whatever, to get that growth rate back up. Unsustainable.
And you're even seeing the investment going even into these smaller kind of lean investing type models, which are more tranched and help you achieve those more significant or those incremental milestones than the classic, here's a boatload of money, just go build this big plan out.
Yeah, no, which is not to say that we don't still see those kind of really crazy monster rounds being done. But I think I think the challenge for investors is you're looking for someone who has the long-term vision to say, I'm trying to do something big, and the short-term discipline to say, I'm going to test my assumptions incrementally. That's a rare combination. And part of what we're trying to instill, with Lean Startup is to help more entrepreneurs develop that combination of activities. So I think Lean Startup is the ultimate in long-term thinking as it applies to a business philosophy, even though most of the time we're talking about quick, speed, rapid experimentation, rapid this. Everything we're talking about is fast. But that's because we're impatient to find out how do we make this long-term thing succeed. And because long-term visions tend to be very complicated, have many, many, many steps to the argument that have to be true, by breaking them down, we're much more likely to make progress.
All right. Okay, Eric, you and I can go on like this forever, but I'd like to give some time to the audience for questions. So, Audrey, if you can kind of read out some of the questions that have come in and direct them at one of us, and we'll do our best to handle it.
Sure. So we have a question from Mark. Maybe Ash can answer this one. How would you recommend applying lean startup practices to existing companies? How would you suggest using the lean canvas and lean dashboard with an existing customer base?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I get that a lot because in the ideal world, people don't start out with a brand new product saying, I'm going to apply these techniques. They already have something built. The nice thing is that the first step with every product, whether it's new or existing, for me, is modeling that business. And so that's where tools like the Lean Canvas, some of the spreadsheet models that Eric's describing, what I would call the customer lifecycle model, doing that to see really baseline and benchmark where are you today? Where is that constraint or bottleneck in your customer acquisition or customer funnel model? And then starting by identifying what is that next thing you need to go improve. And often the answer, again, whether you're doing a new business or have an existing one, is to really get out of the building and start engaging with those customers. It's a gift to have customers. If you've got happy customers that are using your product or unhappy customers that are leaving your product, you can stand to learn a lot from that. So that's a gift that you need to leverage. You need to go out there and try to figure out what's working, what isn't, and use the models that we talked about to try to double down on where you would get the best return on your effort.
Excellent. I have a question for Eric from Rick. Can you suggest a list of questions to ask that will allow you to weed out the smart money from the dumb money?
I wish. Here are the questions I like to ask personally, and, your mileage will vary. And listen, hold on. Before I even answer this question, let me preface this. One thing I find very frustrating as an entrepreneur is the conversation around how to raise money and who to raise money from. People's experience is radically different depending on what their network and their kind of personal wealth and personal stature in the entrepreneurship community looks like. And people talk about it like this advice is universally applicable. So you sometimes see this advice that's like how to choose between Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz if they're both pounding down your door trying to give you money. And listen, I know people that have that problem. I talk about first world problems. That does happen. And, it's very important to choose the right investor so that, but nobody in their right mind would call either of those two firms dumb money. I mean, that's insane. On the other hand, you talk about should I take money from a tier A versus a tier B, VC in Silicon Valley, versus should I take money from Silicon Valley versus someone in my local community if I don't live in Silicon Valley? And you have the millions of entrepreneurs out there that couldn't get a meeting on Sand Hill Road, if their life depended on it. Being like, hey, why are we wasting our time talking about, how to get Mark Andreessen to invest in my company when I'm never going to meet him in my life? So the first thing, I think the most important thing to recognize is that fundraising, investors are not, this is not a rational market. It's very personality and emotionally driven. So as much as I love Silicon Valley, as much as I think we have a very strong meritocracy here, it's not a perfect meritocracy by any means. And there's huge swaths of the population that simply are not eligible to raise money here, which I think is a real shame. So the number one most important thing to think about it with investing from my point of view is to understand how strong your investing case is for the audience you're trying to raise money from. And then among the universe of people that argument will persuade, then to think about who is the smart test money available in that community. And then so just with that caveat, I will actually answer your question, which is, to me, the thing I really want to know is, as an investor, how do you hold your entrepreneurs accountable? What do you look for to decide if a company is making progress? Tell me about situations where you had a company that was struggling but you stuck by the CEO. Tell me about a company that was struggling that you fired the CEO. I like to talk to people, other CEOs in that investor's portfolio, ideally not the ones the investor would recommend. But that all assumes that, they don't, the problem with raising money is investors have a strong incentive to tell you anything you want to hear to get the deal. Just like you have an incentive to tell them everything they want to hear in order to make them want to invest. So I think the really tricky part is trying to figure out how do they really operate? How patient are they with success and failure? To Ash's point, are they looking for the success theater? Or are they going to be constantly pushing you to launch, do a big PR marketing campaign? I mean, when I was first advising startups, I used to go to the board meetings, and I would be the only person in the board meeting saying, don't launch, don't do PR, don't do marketing hype. Although recently, after almost 5 years at this, I actually was sitting in a board meeting where I was the one saying it's time to do the big marketing launch. You guys are underinvesting in customer acquisition. It was very satisfying because it was the engine of growth framework. For those that follow it in detail, it makes very specific claims about when you should and shouldn't do those investments. And I was just doing the math in the boardroom, and I was like, hey, guys, you're actually the rare case. You have it. You guys have product market fit. You were underinvesting. We got to go, go, go. And everybody in the room almost had a heart attack. I'm usually the person saying the opposite. They're very confused. But usually I'm the person saying, don't do that. And with the not bad investors, with the less savvy investors who are on boards, what I see is if I miss a board meeting, this used to happen to me all the time, the next board meeting that I would come back to, they would be discussing the publicist that they'd hired and the PR plans. It was the second I turned my back, boom, it's happening, because there's such pressure to get growth by any means necessary. And, like I said, as much as we put that on the investors, and they certainly bear their responsibility, we as entrepreneurs bear the ultimate responsibility because we set the accountability framework in the first place. And so the number one question is can you go into an investor's office and forget what they say, show them a plan with no vanity metrics in it, and say, here's our learning milestones that we are attempting to achieve. Will they invest on that basis? And the answer for most investors is no. So this assumes you can be picky, but assuming you can, I really think that is the acid test.
All right. Thank you, Eric. We have a question for Ash. Some organizations have budgetary constraints that interfere with the ability to get automation in place, while others have resource constraints in order to get TDD off the ground. What are recommendations for applying good testing principles in those cases?
Well, so I'd ask, so as with everything, things can be done incrementally. So I started out this conversation by talking about how when I first heard about Eric, I'd seen IMView, and there was this massive lean startup machine. They were doing 50 deployments a day, and he was using words like cluster immune system, and that was very, very scary. That would take me years and years and years to go replicate. But then when he talked about it, he talked about how that system was built over 3 years. It wasn't something that they didn't stop development one day and say, let's go hire a whole bunch of engineers just to build things like that, just to build on that learning infrastructure. And so I would use that same argument, depending on the constraints of your business currently. If you don't have lots of customers, there needs to be that incremental investment in the learning systems, in the quality systems, but there are probably bigger fish to fry. You don't have to have, and this may be controversial to some, but I would almost argue that you don't have to have 100% code coverage if you don't yet know if that's something that people actually want. If you do that, and Eric kind of tells a classic story of how he spent 6 months writing 10,000 lines or however many lines of code, only to find out that nobody got past the landing page. So I would say that all those investments need to happen. They can be incremental. The good news also is that I see a lot of service providers, SaaS-based services popping up. So when I was first trying to do things like continuous deployment, I had to roll my own system out, and now we've got lots of options out there. And today we're using a SaaS product, CodeShip, that does that for many platforms, including Rails. So for me, I think things are getting easier from an infrastructure perspective, but at the same time, I'll just go back to the incremental investment answer to that.
You know, I'll throw in one little comment, because I love hearing Ash tell the story, because it is true that by the time we finally got InView, to a 50-person company, we had a very, very, very elaborate continuous deployment system, and it was quite sophisticated. I'm very proud of it, actually. I mean, the team in the intervening years since I've been gone has taken it to even greater heights. But just so everybody knows, here I will confess, for the engineers online, I'll tell you exactly what our initial deployment structure setup looked like, where we were doing continuous deployment. We had a shared instance on a shared hosting provider. Okay, this is before Amazon Cloud, so we're just renting a shared service with lots of other people who have PHP and MySQL crap on their box. We had a MySQL database and a Apache instance, one individual one. And we had a deployment. The deployment was a shell script that I personally wrote that would do a subversion checkout of the latest code and rsync it onto the box from one of our local boxes. Okay, that was the entirety of our continuous deployment system. And from that very humble beginning, just by following the rule that every time we had a problem, we insisted on not having that problem a second time, so make every mistake only one time, we were able to incrementally make it more and more sophisticated bit by bit until it became world-class. So it's critical, as Ash said, just to get started with something simple.
All right, we have a question for both of you. Something that is never talked about in lean startup is the team. Do you guys use any models with a team, quantitative or qualitative?
I don't think I understand the question.
Yeah.
Maybe Ash, take a stab.
There was a topic that I wanted to talk about, and I think it's in that realm. So I'll just rephrase it that way, and hopefully it's doing justice to the question. But I was going to really bring up the topic of specialization. So we've kind of, modern companies today have gone into this highly specialized departmental roles. Sometimes I see them with contradictory success metrics. And so I oftentimes look at lean as being a more cross-disciplinary approach unified by this common goal of serving the customer, delivering value for customer, capturing that value. So what I would what I was going to ask you, Eric, is I know you work a lot with bigger companies where those silos are greater. With startups, it's sometimes easier. They're all resource constrained. We have to wear many hats, and so you get cross-disciplinary just by choice, by force. But in the bigger companies where you get sales and marketing teams and they have sometimes these contradictory success metrics, and you've got developers who are measured by yet different metrics, how does one begin to adapt some of these lean principles in those kinds of organizations?
Oh yeah, no, that's a great way of helping me understand the question. So the first thing is, yeah, listen, a questioner, if this is not answering a question, please re-ask. We will do our best to take your feedback. We're all about iteration here. So what is a startup structure? Like, what does it mean to be a startup team? People in enterprise get this wrong all the time. It is what I call a semi-autonomous, full-time, cross-functional group of people, and hopefully a small group of people. That's not technically required. So let's go through those in turn. Semi-autonomous means they have the ability to make their own decisions within an accountability framework. So, a venture-backed startup is not fully autonomous because they're taking Fred Wilson's money and spending it. So you have to be able to tell him what you did with that money, and if you want more money, you have to go back to him and show that you did a good job, or you're not going to get any more. And luckily, for Fred, no one else is going to give you money if they call up Fred for a reference and says these guys are bozos. So as soon as you take outside resources of any kind, and like I said, your spouse counts as an outside resource, you operate within an accountability framework. But within that framework, the money is yours to spend as you will. So that is sometimes very different in a corporate setting. Cross-functional means every function necessary to make the product work is represented on the team. Software, this is not too difficult. All we really, it's like if we have design and marketing, engineering, and operations represented, that's pretty good. But I've worked in a lot of companies, even small companies, where operations and engineering never talk. They throw things over the wall to each other. Handoffs are the devil in a startup situation. And, you read any of the books about Toyota Production System, they've proven conclusively why handoffs and siloed functions just do not get work done, especially when there's uncertainty and feedback to be processed. And the last is full-time. As much as handoffs are the devil, part-time is the devil. So you cannot ask people to multitask between a highly uncertain project and a regular project. It's simply unfair because, you're an individual engineer in a big company. You come into work each day and you say, what should I spend my time and energy on today? This thing that will definitely get me promoted, or this other thing that, God, I don't know if anything will ever come of it. I think I'll spend my time on the thing that's more certain. So multitasking is a recipe for guaranteed most conservative type of work, and that is the only recipe in our modern world that guarantees failure. You might, if you try something risky, you might succeed, you might fail, but if you take the most conservative path, you are guaranteed to fail. So pulling it all together, let me tell you a story about another one far afield from software. This is a company that makes industrial equipment. So we're talking about stuff that requires heavy manufacturing, major supply chain issues. And I was working with them to try and get their MVP to market sooner. They had, the typical 4 or 5 year plan to develop the new technology. And a big question came up in the course of our work together. One of the people in the workshop said, I happen to have worked for one of our competitors, and they are able to produce a product like this one in about 18 months, not 3 or 4 years like we're planning to do it. And I said, okay, what do they do that's different than us? Are they just smarter than we are? No. Are they have more better technology? No. Better people? No. Are they bigger? No. More budget? No. What's the difference? They work the components in parallel, whereas we insist on doing everything linearly. So, for those who are familiar with manufacturing theory and in the old set-based concurrent engineering argument coming out of Toyota, this simply says, and people in software, we see this too. Like, if you're willing to begin the design of the software in parallel with the implementation of the software, you get better results. But it's very counterintuitive because it necessarily involves some waste. So what happens is, you're designing 2 components that are supposed to be connected to each other. If you design the 2 components in parallel, it's possible that when you try to do the integration, there'll be some slight things that each side didn't quite get right, and you'll have to wind up reworking it to make the 2 sides fit. Whereas if you just design one part and then the next one, you'd be guaranteed that they fit at the cost of delay. So we had this whole argument with this team. And finally, the engineers who were in part of this workshop with me said, listen, that's all well and good, but we can't do it. Sorry, we cannot do it in parallel. And I said, why? And they said, you don't understand. Part of our employee scorecard at the end of the year, our personal evaluation, performance review, one of the categories is how much rework was caused by our designs. So, in normal manufacturing design, if you design a part and then you have to redesign it, that means you did something wrong. It's an indication of shoddy work. So if we do this parallel thing, it will cost more because there'll be more cost, and it will be a problem for us as engineers. And I said, okay, how much more cost is the parallel way of working going to, can someone estimate it for me? And these are engineers, so they can quantify anything, no problem. They sit down and they said it's going to cost an extra $1.8 million to do things in parallel because we'll have to pay for that extra rework. I said, okay. So this is a $100 million program. That's how much it was going to cost the company. So on a $100 million program, we could be in market in 18 months or 3 to 4 years at the cost of an extra $1.2 million or whatever it was. And they're like, uh-huh. So, okay, thinking like a shareholder of this company, you really think it's a good idea to do things all linear? And of course, thinking like a shareholder, everyone was like, of course not. But even after all that, they were like, but you don't understand. What about this performance review issue? It's a deal breaker. So that's why we say that accountability is the foundation of this change. Until senior management is prepared to say that they will hold people accountable differently, that they will insist on breaking down these silos, and that they will allow people to work in this cross-functional way, without that commitment from senior management, I don't believe our established companies can operate with this kind of innovation, and then they're basically doomed. So, not to be your bad news downer for the day, but the good news is this all is required to have this transformation happen is for senior management to be willing to change their behavior. That's it.
Yeah, thanks for the answer, Eric. I know you have a hard stop at the hour, and we're kind of at the hour, so I think we'll move on to the last component here and go into a few slides and wrap up. So, Eric, thanks a lot for being on.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks everybody for tuning in, and hopefully see you all at the Lean Startup Conference. Talk to you later.
All right, thanks, Eric. Bye. All right, everyone. So what I want to do now is take some of these kind of innovation accounting topics we've talked about. I know there are probably more questions, so I'm going to quickly run through a few slides showcasing this innovation accounting framework that has been developed since writing the book that helps you take some of the things we talked about and put it into another practicable framework. And then with whatever time we have left till the hosts allow us to go, I'll be here to take as many questions as you guys have. If you're also using the Running Lean hashtag, I'll go back to them and try to answer as many of them off air on Twitter as well. So I will try to get to all the questions. So in the beginning of the talk, I started with showing this lean canvas. And so while writing the book, this was my way of modeling the business. So this was a top-down model. It took a lot of the core assumptions, the core hypothesis that go into building a business. So much like I use Einstein as an example, much like his simple models to model the universe, which were simple models but not too simple. I look at the lean canvas as being one of those. We can use it to model businesses, and it has all the necessary ingredients, and we can start to mix and match, and at least on paper create something that could be compelling, that could actually tell a story of how we're going to go achieve this business. Now, since that time, one of the things that I have learned and I want to stress is that there is business model generation, which is the creation of business models, and then there's business model validation. And most of the lean startup work, everything we've talked about today, the innovation, accounting, the experimentation, is all in that second bucket. It's all business model validation, and that is much, much greater than just the business model. So I'm not saying that business model generation is easy, but I would say that in the lifespan of a product or a startup, it is a small component of it. And so what I encourage entrepreneurs to do is to go out there and really time box that initial business model generation. Now, we can spend a lot of time brainstorming the perfect model. We can spend months writing that business plan. But I oftentimes challenge entrepreneurs to spend 20, 30 minutes just documenting their core assumptions as they are in their head today. And things that they don't know, things that they're unsure about, that's great. That's actually a gift. Those are probably things that you should go figure out by getting outside the building. Maybe it's talking to customers, maybe it's talking to advisors, maybe it's talking to investors even to see what has happened in that particular domain of the problem that you're addressing. So for me, a lot of the work goes in that business model validation camp. And so what I want to share today is this new framework that I've been working on, taking a lot of these ideas and putting it together. And I want to start out with a disclaimer. So this is a quote that I have up here from Jeffrey Liker, who's written a lot of the Toyota Way books. And he talks about Toyota as a company. So when they were first doing the original lean, a lot of people kind of laughed at them and said, these guys are building cars in this very funny non-assembly way, and it's never going to work. And only when they started encroaching on market share did people take them seriously, and they're like, well, let's go and see what they're doing. And Toyota welcomed them with open arms and actually began to teach them a lot of these lean techniques, invite them to their factories, allow them to look at their systems and processes. These companies went back and pretty much tried to imitate just the tools and processes without internalizing the core principles behind them. And it's no surprise that they weren't able to achieve the same kinds of results. So I find that same parallel also applies a lot with the lean startup. I started out by saying that this stuff is principally easy to understand, but it's very hard to put to practice, and it's for some of these reasons. And so even though I'm showing you, and maybe I'll go to this next slide, I'm going to show you this new framework. At the end of the day, this is just a tool. The lean canvas is just a tool. The business model canvas is just a tool. It's really internalizing the thought process that goes along with it. It's going through the paces. It's going through the thought processes with your team, with your external stakeholders, whether advisors or investors, and using those conversations to get to those big insights. And so it's really that I want to communicate here more than the specific boxes to fill and what it is that you should do here. But I'll still use this as a model to kind of walk through how we can take some of these innovation accounting ideas and put them to practice. So this is a new board that we designed. So we're calling this thing the lean stack. And the first part of the lean stack is still the lean canvas. And so that's the top-down model that you need to put in place to be able to model the business. And then you've got I'm sorry. I think I was kind of getting an incoming call, which probably may have cut me off. I'm not sure. But I was getting into describing what this lean stack is, and it really the first part of the lean stack is the lean canvas, which is still that top-down model that captures your vision. This other board is there to help you capture that business model validation part. So this is all the experiment design, all the milestones and success metrics that we've been talking about for the last hour. So this board can be divided down the middle. The left-hand side of that board are things we expect to happen. So much like a scientist, we have to make these declarations up front. We can't just go into the lab and start mixing compounds and wait to see what happens. The right-hand side of the board is what actually happened, and there is a feedback loop from left to right that helps us keep the two in balance because they're not always going to be in balance. Now, if you walk through this board, the top left-hand side is where we declare those success metrics. So these would be, Eric was talking about this Excel model. So at scale, what do we expect the business to be doing? And I kind of break that down into three stages. So I look at scale as the finished, realized story of the business model. And then there's product market fit, which is us reaching a point of higher success. So we have reached a significant milestone, the first significant milestone in the startup life cycle, where we know that we have achieved some success, that we're not going to fail. The question is how much can we actually, what is the upside? How big can we make this? Can we achieve our scaling goal, or do we fall short? So that will be the second stage, product market fit. And then the first stage, problem solution fit, is the very early ideation stage, which is where we are really weighing sometimes multiple projects against each other and trying to prioritize which ones to double down on. So Eric made a very important point about how you can't work on two startups part-time. You can't work on two different ideas at the same time. So it's that same concept. You can do some of this early validation in parallel, but at some point you have to double down on one of those products. So that's what the first part helps you capture. And what we do here is we would create some success metrics. And I'm not going to talk about the process of how you do it. There's a lot of other blog content that I have that gets into that, but I just want to show you more of the flow of this board. But it's very important to know where you're going, and that's why the success metric stuff is important, because otherwise we're just, again, waiting to see what happens. So here I'm using a customer number. So I'm talking about at scale, if I can acquire or if I can retain 2,000 paying customers at a particular lifetime value, kind of the things Eric was describing, I have a business model that works. And if I could have 1/10 of that, that would be my product market fit stage. And then 1/10 of that, in this case, I'm using an order of 10 rule of thumb, would be my problem solution fit stage. And so this is how I model the significant milestones of my business and what I would use to communicate with both my internal and external stakeholders. Now, once you've got that clarity of your overall success metrics, the bottom left-hand side of the board is all about formulating a strategy. So it's coming up with a series of experiments that you can go do to effect that. And we want to start not with the scale, of course, because that could be several years out, but we start with what is within our horizon. And I like to use a quarterly goal. So I like to say, what can we actually achieve in 3 months or less? And let's create a key objective. And I'm also a fan of creating just one key objective, which is a big kind of a leap of faith kind of objective, or it's a big, hairy goal, but it's within that 3-month horizon. So in this particular case, I try to see what I have on this chart. I've got a $20,000 MRR, which stands for monthly recurring revenue. So in this particular product, within the next 3 months, I want to get it from wherever it is today to making that much in revenue, and that's one of the key objectives that I would have for that period. So that's obviously a revenue goal. It doesn't have to always be revenue. It could still be something else. It could be learning based. It could be customer based. But all of that, remember, has to be tied back to customers in some way. So once you've got that key objective identified, we then begin to formulate a series of steps, and these will be the experiment design component. And so there's an experiment queue, and it's a lot, if you're familiar with the Kanban board concept, it's like a backlog. And this is where you begin to stage what might be the steps that you're going to, kind of the macro steps that you're going to take to achieve that goal. So in this particular case, I might want to do some channel testing. Maybe I'm going to test some different SEO campaigns or Google AdWords campaigns, and so that might be some experiments that I run. If those go well, I might want to pursue other types of testing. Maybe this is a product where I am going to start to systemize the sales process. So maybe I invest in more educational content. Maybe I'm going to do an email content marketing campaign, or even hire a salesperson. All of those are kinds of experiments that I can run. And the goal of all of those things is to get me to that key objective. So this allows you to take the big, overall end goal and break it down to something that's a lot more achievable in those 3 months that still aligns with the overall goal, and begin to plan out those experiments. All right, and then once you've got those experiments laid out, there's a lot of detail that goes into each of those cards. The idea of those cards is to just come up with a strategy for how you would achieve that goal. The middle part of this board is where you track your running experiments, and you recognize the build, measure, learn loop here from the lean startup. So we start out with picking up one of those experiments in the queue, the first one in the queue. So this is an ordered queue. So I pick up the first experiment, put it in the build stage, and then we start getting ready for it. So we might have to do, build a product, build a landing page, do whatever is encompassed with it. It doesn't even have to be a product. It could be an interview script that we put together. But whatever it is that you build, that's what we track in that build stage, and then it would move through the other paces. I'm just going to show you a screenshot of what goes behind one of those cards. So there's this one-page 8-3 report, which was very much inspired by Toyota's 8-3 report. So if you're at Toyota, whether you're building a car or you're building a bolt that goes on the door of a car, they capture all the problem solution descriptions of the project they're working on a single page. So they're big fans of one-page reports. I'm a big fan of one-page reports as well. So Lean Canvas is a one-page model. The dashboard is a one-page model, and this experiment report is a one-page model. But the things you put here are everything we talked about. So you talk about what it is we're trying to achieve, what are those falsifiable hypotheses that we need to be able to achieve to know when this experiment runs. A very important component of this is going to be time boxing. We want to predict by when we want to achieve those things, because otherwise we run experiments just indefinitely. And then we want to capture results and put them on this board. So at the end of the day, you not only have a one-page report that somebody in your company can read and say, okay, I know what you did for this experiment and what you learned and what your next action was, but it also creates this archive of learning. We've had situations where we have brought new members on the team, and it would have been a great, and at that point we weren't we weren't documenting our learning in this fashion, and so we often get into lots of discussions about, have you tried this? Oh, yes, we have, and this is what we learned. had we had an archive of that learning, we could just point a new employee as training to say, go and look at the last 30 experiments we have run, and you'll get up to speed on where we are with this product. So it's a very powerful tool. And at Toyota, they actually are very old school there. So they don't, I think they're now trying to make this be more electronic, but they literally write these on one sheet of paper, and it goes in a binder, and it kind of gets copied and sent across the different departments, but it gets filed in this cabinet of their library of learning. So that's a very kind of powerful concept to kind of build an archive of learning for your company. And if you write it well, it doesn't have to be this boring document. It almost reads like a novel of your challenges. So you had this goal, you did these experiments, you either passed or failed, and it can be quite entertaining to read, and you can definitely make that so. But if you come back to this board, that's what goes in those cards. As you're going through these different stages from build, measure, learn, you would move those cards. So once you've done building this experiment out, the moment it's in front of customers, the moment you start getting that first customer interaction, that's when it goes into the measure stage, and then finally it goes into the learn stage. And a product, once it's in the learn stage, or experiment once in the learn stage, has to either be validated or invalidated. It cannot be in between. So even if you run out of time, if you weren't able to achieve your goal within that time, that's an automatic invalidation. So you had made a prediction that you could get 20 customers within 3 months, and you only have 10. It doesn't mean that you kill the product off, but it does mean that you have a conversation about why you didn't achieve those 20 customers and what can you do to course correct and get back on track. So that experiment would be marked kind of red and go into the completed archives, which is what we show on the right-hand side. So that's where we would stack all the experiments, and you can see red and green cards, and that gives you a 20-foot report card of how your experiments are performing. I don't want you to get too carried away with having all greens here, because when we first start out, I often like to say that the initial parts of every product is going to be mired with a lot of failed experiments, and so you're going to probably see a lot of red before you see some green. And so we want to be more objective than try to chase just the successful path here. But the idea with the right-hand side is that it starts to show what that learning has been. The top right-hand side here is about incorporating the customer lifecycle model. So whether this is an Excel spreadsheet that begins to model how your customer acquisition and your activation, retention, the product metrics model that I showed early on, how that's going to work at scale, or sorry, how that's working currently, that's what you want to show here. And this is where you begin to identify where the constraints might be in your current funnel. It could be that you don't yet have your value metrics figured out. So even though you're getting lots of customers in through your Google ad campaign, most of them are just churning within a few days because you're just not delivering on value, or the onboarding experience is terrible. And you can see that with these numbers, which creates the feedback loop for you to prioritize what are the next experiments you run. So that's where that feedback loop manifests itself, where once you start running a few experiments, you put the learning in motion, and then that's what creates the next set of experiments that run. So again, much like I'm not a big fan of top-down modeling, I'm not a big fan of planning out experiments too far into advance. And so I oftentimes say if you just plan out 3 months with the expectation that you're going to review these, the experiments cadence themselves need to be shorter. They cannot be 3-month experiments. The experiments themselves, I like to target 2 weeks, and sometimes as you get more advanced, you can start running even 1-day experiments or a few days experiments. But I like to keep them no longer than 2 weeks so that it allows you to course correct along the way. So your initial strategy, that experiment queue, it might start a particular way, but as you go and run experiments, you find out that you have to make a drastic pivot. And so you're going to change that strategy. You're going to change the next set of experiments that you run. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what this board is really about. And this is the final point that I want to end on, is that a lot of these breakthrough insights that we've been talking about all these times are really hidden inside the failed experiments. And so I'd like to kind of channel Buckminster Fuller here, who is a very well-known, celebrated scientist who doesn't believe in failed experiments. He talks about unexpected outcomes. And if we have that vocabulary, we kind of raise our tolerance for failure, and we are a lot more bolder in making these bold predictions. And when we don't get the expected outcome that we have in mind, it just goes down to basics. You have to get down to that root cause analysis. There are lots of techniques there. You can use 5 whys. You can use more kind of a more logical tree approach. There's different ways that you can go out there and do that root cause analysis, going out and even just talking to customers that failed in those experiments can yield a lot of qualitative information, which helps you understand why you failed and helps you then formulate the next experiment, the next hypothesis to go test. So with that, I'd like to kind of stop the slides and we can spend the rest of the time doing questions. I did want to point out that this tool, the Lean Stack tool that I kind of showed here, we have turned it into a live tool. So if we hopefully have some readers of running Lean, you know that I bundle Lean Canvas with it. We're doing something similar. So we have a special URL there. If you go there, we have a promotion going on for those that might be interested in giving Lean Stack a go. So that's all I'll kind of say on that. And with that, Yasmina, Audra, we can turn to more questions if we have them.
Excellent. We do have quite a few questions. Frank asks, for software development in particular, where the products and end goals are often moving targets, what are some good good suggestions and ideas to keep in mind in order to apply the Lean techniques while still keeping mobile in the very active market?
Sure. So in a state of constant change, how do you still apply Lean? And I think Lean is the perfect place. So Eric made a very good point about how we want to think long term. So we want to build products that really are successful, that build these sustainable competitive advantages. They're not just a Me Too kind of a product, which is just kind of doing feature parity with other things and rapidly changing. So we want to have that long-term vision, that long-term strategy, which is built on that competitive advantage. But at the same time, we want to kind of rapidly experiment our way to be able to get to that advantage. And I would say that the Lean startup techniques allow you to do that innovation at a very fast pace. And at the end of the day, it's really a question of he who innovates faster wins. So if it's between you and a competitor, as long as you are learning from customers faster, and so when I say innovate, that's a very overloaded term. I specifically mean learning about customers faster than your competition. If you can learn faster than your competition and build those products faster, you will gain that market share, and you will start to begin those either explicit or implicit unfair advantages.
All right. Bob says, I'm working for a not-for-profit startup offering crisis listening services to teens via texting. The goal is to help teens move out of crisis, and thus, ideally, our users will not use our system long term because they will no longer be in crisis. Because of our model, I'm struggling to define an ideal engine of growth because we don't actually plan to retain users.
Yeah, so I heard that you're a not-for-profit, so that may not necessarily be a bad thing, but I would say that, so that comes down to the lifetime value question. If you have a short lifetime value, the sticky engine of growth is not really going to work for you. So you really only have, and the viral engine of growth is like and Eric touched on that a little bit. The viral is really different from word of mouth, and is really meant for viral businesses like Facebook, which work more like viruses. It's a side effect of using a product. So that really leaves you with that paid engine of growth. As long as your cost of customer acquisition is less than whatever that lifetime value is, you've got an engine of growth, and that's what I would really pursue and what I would double down on. Now, that said, it may seem like you're just stuck with one option, but within that paid engine of growth, there are lots of efficiencies that can be drawn. One of the more common and often neglected tactics is just simply raising prices. So one way to increase lifetime value is by raising prices. And if you double prices and don't have your customers disappear, if you don't lose more than half of your customers, then you've actually still got a better model than you have today. So there can be some price optimization that can be done there to increase that lifetime value. Of course, there are lots of efficiencies on how you acquire customers. Maybe there are less capital-intensive approaches to acquire them, more inbound type channels, and that's where you kind of tune that engine of growth. And then finally, it's just also a question of who is the real customer, right? So when you say not-for-profit, I sometimes hear social entrepreneurship where the real metric of progress is really the number of people impacted. So if you're in to have the biggest amount of impact and not make a profit, there are other ways. And so obviously we have not-for-profits like the Red Cross where the customers aren't the users. And so that's where donation models come in. We've got things like National Public Radio here, which is also a similar type of a model. So I would say that there are, so I would kind of just use that for food of thought. I would say your engine of growth is paid. The question is, based on your goal, where are those levers that you can push to basically affect that business model?
Great, thank you. Diego asks, I'm interviewing suppliers before interviewing buyers to open a drop shipping online store. Since this type of business model involves having to please two types of customers, how do you solve the conflicting feedback?
Sure. Hopefully you should get, I would say hopefully you should get feedback that is complementary. So if you got suppliers and buyers, there are situations, and Facebook is a classic example, where their customers and users are at odds with each other. Their customers are the advertisers, and they want to show users as many ads as possible and get them clicked, and the users don't want to click on any ads. And so there you actually have an inherent conflict of interest, and Facebook and everyone in that ad kind of a business has to cross that fine, has to play that fine balance between people paying for their true customers and their needs as well, and balancing that with what users need, because if the users are vaporized, you don't get the other. But most of the times I see in a marketplace type of a model, you have to create a win-win situation. And so I maybe want to learn more about your particular business, but if you have suppliers and buyers, I would say that you'd want to try to figure out some balance where the suppliers win, because using your platform, there is a reduction in market friction. So the buyers and suppliers are probably working together anyways. What you're maybe providing in a marketplace model is removing some of that friction. And so as long as you're providing more value and removing that friction, you should, even though the per unit economics might go down, the overall pie should grow, and that's really where how these marketplace models work. So you look at eBay, it's not that people weren't buying and selling cars and all the other things that we buy and sell on eBay. It's just that it makes it a lot more efficient platform. So I would kind of push you in that direction to try to find if you can find complementary value propositions across all sides, then having them be contradictory.
We have a question here. Do you use the lean stack from the beginning, problem to solution fit, or more during scaling?
That's a good question. So the question was, so as I mentioned before, the lean stack is a combination of the lean canvas as well as the experiment board. But the short answer is that I look at it as being used from day one. So the very first thing would be beginning to model your business. So I would start out with describing the business model on the lean canvas. In there, one of the boxes is the key metrics box, and one of the questions I ask you there is, let's talk about your goal. Why are you doing this business? Do you want to build a $100 million business or a $10 million business? What is that success metric where if you could wave a magic wand, fast forward 3 to 5 years, how would you know this product was successful? And that is the entry point into the success metrics section in that lean dashboard. And so you want to start with that, and then you want to figure out your pricing model and then start to figure out how many customers you need to get, and then model that. So as Eric was saying, you want to build that spreadsheet model. The lean stack helps you do it in that top left-hand side. So with the success metrics, you begin to model what kind of a business you want to build, so what is the end goal, and what is the deadline or timeline attached to it. So I would start with that, and then everything that I showed you of how you run experiments can start being done from day one. So if you have to go and validate problem-solution fit, what are the next experiments you go run? Maybe your goal is within a 2-month period, you want to have 10 paying customers or 10 verbal commitments or 10 letters of intent. You would make that be your key objective. You would then start to chart out what are the things you would do. So you might, if you follow the running lean process, you would go out and want to run problem interviews and solution interviews, maybe build some landing pages, start to do some testing. And when you get to those 10 customers, you would have achieved that goal and then move on to the next objective. So it's a very iterative process.
Great. We have just a couple more questions here. I've just started reading the Lean series books. I'm almost finished with the Lean Startup. What order would you recommend I read the others? Running Lean, Lean Analytics, the Lean Product Book, Lean UX for Lean Startups?
Yeah, so I would say that the first book that you picked was the right one. So I know that Eric, and you've probably seen from the call today, he's very technical, but the book that he wanted to, his blog is a lot more kind of had a lot more how-to information. The book you wanted to write, though, on the other hand, was more of a why lean startup book. So it paints the picture of the methodology. It shows a lot of case studies of everyone from the government to startups to big enterprises applying it and how they're applying it. So it gives you a lot of inspiration, it gives you a lot of ideas for how to do it. The book that I wanted to write was more of a how-to lean startup book. So once you have, if you look at a customer lifecycle, once you've gone from being unaware to being interested in lean startup, a book like mine would be something you would use to say, well, let me see what are the next steps that I can take there. So it's a very practical, hands-on book, as are the other books in the series. So I would say that mine still tends to be a general overview of the methodology, while many of the others, like Lean Analytics, get down to specific topics. So if you are struggling with how to model your business, I would say you should go buy a Lean Analytics book so you can begin to understand what Alistair and Ben have done really well is they've taken these models for different kinds of business models and showed you what numbers are really the right numbers to measure and what are good numbers in each of those business models. So some of those questions that I was asking Eric. So if you're at that stage, now you may not be at that stage. You might still be in the very early ideation stage, but if you're at that stage, that's the right book to pick. If you were struggling with UX because you're building a web app, then the Lean UX. So I think a lot of those are topical books. If you ask me, the simple answer is you should buy all of them, but I would definitely say that because we have finite time, I would start out with the more general to more specific books based on need and based on things you need to apply in your business. Personally, I'm more of a very action-oriented reader. I don't pick up a book unless I can apply it to my business if I'm reading a business how-to book. So I would make that same recommendation, is that reading something you're not going to use can provide good reference information, but it's better to have something that you can test it on.
All right. So Keith and Dawn have a similar question here. I'd love to hear Ash's input on how to create good experiments, more than just quick landing pages. How does one quickly iterate and create experiments in, say, a mobile environment or more complex channels and relationships? Well,
so I guess I'm not understanding the question exactly, but I'll try to do my best to answer. So how does one create experiments? So for me, it really starts with creating that, and maybe I answered in the last question, but I'll kind of repeat some of that, is that you really have to start with that overall goal and then break it down to the short-term goal of what it is you want to achieve. And then the actual experiment that you run really comes from insights and experiences. So even using the Einstein analogy, as Eric was mentioning, he wasn't just sitting in the patent office doing nothing and got hit by the stroke of genius and came up with the theories of relativity. He had been internalizing and consuming a lot of content out there. And in much the same way, you have to become the domain expert in your particular business, in your particular problem domain, on your particular customers. And sometimes that is by studying other companies, so studying analogs, so companies that were successful or maybe are still successful in your space, studying analogs, those that try to do similar things but failed. Why did they fail? What can we learn from those failures? So again, a lot of parallels with science. We can stand on the shoulders of giants to see a little bit further. But using that kind of observation or that kind of background learning is where we come up with our belief systems. What are our leaps of faith? So company A failed, but they failed because they were in the wrong market, or they were in the market at the wrong time, and these were the reasons why they failed. So because of that, we're going to try something different. That would be one of the more riskier leaps of faith. So I would push you to say, let's test that now to see if the timing is right. Rather than waiting 6 months to test one of those core hypotheses, let's go and see if we can run an experiment to test it now. And hopefully that's kind of steering the question in the right direction. But I would say that's how I would approach kind of experiment design and experiment setup.
Great. Thank you so much, Ash. We're going to cut the questions there. We do have a few more, so people will probably be reaching out to you. But thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and thanks to Eric. I'm glad he was able to join us as well. And if there's anything further you'd like to go over before we end the webcast, I'll leave you there, and then we'll just remind people that we do have this archive going up within 48 hours.
All right. No, thanks a lot. I would say this would be a good place to end. And as I mentioned, the invitation to send questions over Twitter or even email, my email is pretty easy. It's just ash@spark59. Would be welcome, and I'll spend the next hour or so just replying to every question that I get. So definitely welcome that, and thanks for being on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope to have you at future events, and we want to just remind you that Ash's book, Running Lean, is the deal of the day. If you go to O'Reilly.com, you'll see the book widget on the right handle, and you can just go ahead and click it there. But thanks again. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening from wherever you are. Goodbye.